So this is my title, How PayPay Flea Market Migrated from Paging 2 to Paging 3. I am Nagahama. This is the agenda. This session will be about Android paging libraries. First, after a brief self-introduction, I will talk about what kind of services I am involved with, PayPay Flea Market. Then I will talk about what kind of library Paging 3 is, why it is necessary to migrate, and how I did it. Next, I will discuss what we paid attention to when migrating and share with you the 3 findings. Code that causes endless API calls, proprietary implementation around database that caused problems in migration, advantages of migrating state to state adapter, and points to consider. So let me start my self-introduction. In 2021, I joined Yahoo Japan Corporation as a new graduate. I have been in charge of Android application development for PayPay Flea Market. Recently, I'm working on migrating Paging 2 to Paging 3. Next, I would like to explain the service, PayPay Flea Market. It is a service specialized in flea markets, and you can pay with PayPay. It is also possible to make offers and consult about the price you want to buy at. It is also linked to Yahoo Auctions, so it has a large number of products. PayPay Flea Market Android uses the paging library for screens that load large amounts of data, such as the screen that displays recommended products. So let's talk about paging 3. Paging process is when you take a big chunk of data and split into smaller chunks to retrieve only necessary data, and paging 3 is the third version of the official paging library that can easily implement a paging process, which means the users do not have to retrieve large amounts of data, thus reducing bandwidth consumption. So why did we need to migrate? There are 3 main reasons. With the release of Paging 3, Paging 2 is now deprecated. This means that it will not be updated and we will not be able to benefit from the latest releases. Up to Paging 2, only live data was supported, but from Paging 3, coroutine flow is supported. This makes it more compatible with apps implemented using coroutine flow. Finally, because this has a good affinity. And finally, what I personally find most noteworthy is that Paging 3 provides the state of data loading. This eliminates the need to define and manage the read state in your own implementations of repository, view model, etc., allowing you to focus more on the logic to do the coding. Next, PayPay Flea Market, we are accommodating business size requirement for migration. So why? The release was May 2021, but why now? So first of all, as a team, since it is deprecated, we need to migrate before Paging 2 disappears from the library. But there were 3 reasons. No research done on the migration. And number 2 is unclear if Paging 3 is stable in operation. It's not a matter of stability, but paging through update of the library with the behavior and the spec change, whether or not this would operate in a stable manner. We were not able to find out. And no implementation experience with other services. So there were very few cases of migrating with other services, so we were watching them. So after I joined Yahoo Japan, I researched and did a proposal. So at a high level, I'll explain how we migrated to Paging 3. Please refer to the official documentation for details. First, logic related to the data acquisition is handled by boundary callback. We migrated it to remote mediator. Next, data display is handled by a paged list adapter. This was migrated to paging data adapter. Finally, the processing around state was migrated to low state flow. First, I'll explain the migration of boundary callback to remote mediator. So migrate the boundary callback to remote mediator and use a pager instead of live paged list builder to return data as paging data. This completes the migration of the type of data to be displayed and the part to be retrieved. So next is the adapter part that we need to migrate, which is responsible for the logic related to data acquisition is migrated to remote mediator. So on the left, you can see the implementation in the past, and the new one on the right. And we had to change before a migration. However, now we will do the page loading adapter, and load state adapter will be used. And then the state no longer will have to be managed. So I talked about the areas that we paid attention to. There were three. First is start from screens having minimal impact on services, and summarize and share the method of migration to paging 3. And number 3, a migrated original implementation relevant to state and performing refactoring at the same time. So first, migrated from the screens having minimal impact on services. So first, as an assumption, there is a possibility of causing malfunction, degradation. We have to be careful, and as a team, we've paid attention. However, sometimes, due to the lack of knowledge, it can happen. For this reason, in the case of PayPay Flea Market, we migrated from screens that do not affect the main functions such as purchases and transactions. In this way, we gradually accumulated knowledge through migration and avoided malfunctions on major screens by migrating from screens that had little impact on the service. Next, summarizing and sharing the method of migrating paging 3, we documented and shared with the team how to migrate to paging 3, so that knowledge would not become personalized. And so like in the previous implementation and new implementation, we compare the two. By doing so, we were able to avoid overlooks and missing items.
So now the third point, that is about the original implication that is done at the same time as the migration. So the PayPay Flea Market Android team is conducting a thorough check before the release. But this is already done, but in addition, we also perform refactoring for DB and state when we migrate paging. By performing the refactoring at the same time as migration, we can address the debt issue. Furthermore, since migration to paging 3 and the migration to DB and state have the same scope in terms of operation checks, it is more efficient to perform the migration and refactoring at the same time and check the debt at the same time instead of performing refactoring at different times and spending the time and the cost for the same checks. So those were the precautions that we are taking, and there are some insights that we have gained through this experience. First, fatal code that makes infinite API calls. Second, proprietary implementation about the database, which caused problems at migration. The third is benefits of migrating state to load, share, flow, and points to be considered. So before talking about the points to be considered, I'd like to recap on how we migrate to paging 3. We first migrate boundary callback to remote mediator. Second, we migrated the page list adapter, which is responsible for data display, to paging data adapter. And third, we migrated the processing around state to load state flow. So we changed instead of live page list builder, we used the pager to move to paging data. And then we moved the adapter responsible for display from page to list adapter to paging data adapter. Basically, the migration only requires changing the inheriting class to paging data adapter. Lastly, we migrate the processing around the state to load state flow. In the past, we were doing changing the state to loading before reading data and displaying the loading at the point where the change is received. But after the migration, we don't have to manage the state anymore. And so far, I've talked about how we migrated. Next, I'd like to talk about the fatal code that make infinite API calls. This is important to note when using only downward scrolling. This occurs due to the load function of a remote mediator. So this is the fatal code that makes infinite API calls. To prevent infinite API calls from occurring, we have modified the code. Do you know where the change is? I know that it's difficult. So the highlighted portion is the code we changed so that we can prevent that from happening. So what kind of change is it? So let me explain. If the load type of the upward loading is prep end, we want to prevent loading, and we use the true. So mediator result success, we want to return end of pagination reached true. So why is it necessary? The answer lies in the loading order. So let's take a look at the loading order. Now, with the load function of a remote mediator, let's see how codes are read. Let's compare the code that causes infinite API calls and the code modified to prevent it. Here is the log for the code that doesn't cause API infinite calls. After the initial loading, upward loading takes place, and then downward loading takes place. That is append.
Next, let's look at the log of the code that causes endless API calls. After the initial load, upward reads are performed and downward reads are not performed. And internally, the code knows that upward reads are being performed. Unlike the log of the code where endless API calls did not occur, internally, upward reads are being performed, a behavior not intended by a person who implemented it. In addition, judgment of initial state without scrolling is a judgment of upper end, and we can find that out from the log. So already it recognizes that it is making an upward call. So this is unlike the code where endless API calls did exist. Internally, upward reads are being performed, a behavior not intended by the person who implemented it. In addition, judgment of initial state without scrolling, a judgment of upper end. So what this causes is that a remote remediator, when look at the data, it goes until the end, and it finds out that there is no data, no more. So with that said, I'll explain how the endless API calls happen. First, since the initial state is an judgment of upper end, recognizing the lack of data, remote mediator calls the API. Internally, it recognizes upward loading, so it recognizes that data is being added in the upward direction. However, the implementation assumed that only downward scrolling is used, so data is added below. Furthermore, if the user is not scrolling, the data will remain superscripted, so judgment of terminal takes place. This repeats, and the API is called endlessly. So API calls, and it turns out that not the top, but the bottom, there was data being added, and there is no judgment, so that is why it keeps on adding the data. So until when will this continue? Until all the data is collected, API will be called. There's no point in using the paging library, and it will consume the bandwidth of the user. And imagine if many users do this. I don't want to even think about it, but the backend will come down, and at least there will be a load on it. To prevent this, we need to add a process so that no processing is done for upward load. Now let me go to the second problem, proprietary implementation of a database. Let me explain the problem. In PayPay Flea Market, Android old code information about the state and the product were stored together in the database. From paging 3, by using load state flow, we can get the information about the state, so no need to store it in database. However, leaving the implementation of state for the same screen in both database and load state flow is not a good idea because it means to leave unnecessary implementations. And the implementation will have to be reviewed again in the future. In other words, we had to find a way to avoid incomplete migration. So before I talk about migration method, what implementation was in database, there was a flag to indicate whether or not there was data. This flag was converted into an object to indicate that there were no data, and adapter was used to display the product or to indicate that there was no data. In order to migrate without leaving these original implementations behind, PayPay Flea Market migrated as follows. First, we separated the processes related to the display, such as state, from the database and consolidated state into fragment. Next, data acquisition processes, such as boundary callback, were migrated. Finally, we migrated to manage the state based on the load state flow of the paging data adapter. First, let's talk about separating state and other display-related processes from the database. In this example, the flags are removed from the database. Next, let's look at aggregating state to fragment. And as you can see on the left-hand side, this is the old and new, and like on the left, view holder and state zero match holder, they coexist. So make it so that we separate and leave just the state. Next, as I mentioned, I will be light here because I talked about it, but the adapter and boundary callback, these were migrated.
And using this load state flow, if it is should be shown, and then we will state it. That's the description we make. In this case, item adapter is providing load state flow. We get the latest value state if it's a load state loading, and then we will show the loading. That's the standard process we are adding. In this way, if we do the migration, anybody can do the migration and move to load state flow without any problem. And then we can make the implementation easier in the future and less costly. So third one, the benefits of advantages and considerations to be made. First, in terms of the benefit, state-related logic can be put together around the fragment and integrated into a fragment. And also, as the loading information is provided by library, there is no need to perform the implementation by ourselves. And there are two considerations to be make. When the display is divided based on the loading information of multiple APIs, it is complicated. But we need to complete the status of two adapters, for example, and think about the details. That's why it's complicated. I will explain this later. And secondly, load state requires some filtering due to large amount of data flowing through it. Before I go into that, load state flow, load state, there are three: initial loading, upward loading, and downward loading. Those are the three. And there are three load types. For each combined load state, for those, one is not loading, another is loading, and the other is error. Although the access flow is temporary, in order to determine that the initial loading is happening or loading is occurring, it is necessary to determine that the refresh of load state flow is a load state loading. The part of the code that narrows down the loading state was omitted for clarity, but in reality, this kind of access is required. Item adapter load state flow has to be obtained, and then refresh or initial loading. If it's a load state loading, and then we will indicate the loading. That's the condition. Earlier, regarding load state flow, we talked about it. We will talk about, based on that, we will talk about the fact that it is complicated. So when the display is divided based on the load information of multiple APIs, but since combined logic is required, it may be necessary to consider whether it is easier to use the existing repository. For example, load state requires some filtering due to large amount of data flow. If the other adapter is also loading, and then we will do the loading, that's the kind of detailed logic we can make. It's not only this. If the load state flow is more complicated because it needs to take into account the large amount of data flow. Next, load state requires some filtering due to large amount of data. So let's take a look at the log. The log shows that the large amount of data is flowing during the load stage alone. So a large amount of data flow may cause a problem with the state, depending on the implementation method. So for this reason, we can use the load type so that we will only receive the flow of the initial loading state, for example, or by using distinct until changed, we can make sure that the value is not passed on if it has not changed from the last time. And then this way, we don't have to worry about issues with the state, and we can concentrate on coding. Let's take a look at the log after the modification. The log after correction is shown here. As you can see, the necessary information is now flowing properly, and there is no need to worry about the display being erratic due to the large amount of data flow. Today, I explained how we performed the migration for PayPay Flea Market Android, some of the challenges as well as the insights. Thanks to the migration, we can now use various features with compatibility with the core routine flow and provide load state. There are many more details I wanted to share, such as page setting. I hope my presentation was useful for your projects. Thank you.
Nagahama-san, thank you very much. From here, we would like to hold plus talk, and the interviewer will ask questions that he or she was concerned about, and we would like to entertain questions from the audience as well. On bottom right, there is a question mark on your screen. You will be able to post your questions. So the interviewer is from line Kenichi Ikenaga. So Ikenaga-san, can you introduce yourself briefly? Thank you for this opportunity. I am in charge of Land Android. Nagahama-san, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. Thank you. So the 3 points that you paid attention to start from minimal impact, documentation, and all of them were very important. So my first question has to do with migration to page 3. So it's the replacement of library. So this is not a business requirement, but I understand that this came from the development requirement. So PayPay Flea Market, business requirement and development requirement. How do you prioritize in proceeding with your work? So this time around, this was migration, and business requirement becomes the priority. So if we have room for development resources, then we will introduce the resources, allocate resources to the migration project. So basically, business requirements are the priority, yes. In doing so, from the development side, there may be like operating system updates that you have to do. You will take into consideration the priority, and can the customer side can prioritize. So if it's an update which is urgent, yes, that could be incorporated, but more often we place priority on business requirements. Thank you very much. So you did the study, the research, and you proposed to migrate from paging 2 to 3. In proposing, the planning and the project managers and for other developers, in order to get their support and gain approval, were there anything that you took note of? Well, the second point that I paid attention to in migration, that was the documentation of migration methods. So that was very close. In introducing to the product, the impact sphere, and there are concerns, of course, so I compiled those. And in starting the development, the migration methodology were being studied. So I did share those information as well. But most important was this compiled documentation, share with the team, and get a feedback whether or not I have missed anything or not. Okay, thank you very much. So on the development side, I agree with how you interfaced them. How about the planning side people? In order to convince them, were there anything that you did? Well, for the development, avoiding degradation from the current state. So nothing particular was proposed to the planning side. Okay, thank you. Moving on to the next question. So migration methodology was compiled and you shared with everyone. So for other engineers, I'm sure that you will be requesting them to work on the migration because you're not going to do all the changes to yourself, by yourself. And changing the common area and requesting to other engineers. I've done that in the past, but there is progress or projects of other teams. You will not be able to control the progress. And sometimes there were challenges that the work did not progress. So when making requests to other teams, are there anything that you pay attention to so that the project will progress? Well, the migration was successful this time around, but many people were spontaneously and voluntarily working on it. But the reason why a progress is not made, it is because they don't know how to implement or how to progress. So migration documentation, as I mentioned earlier, sharing them these documents will help them. And when it comes to the scope of work, I'm sure that it will be clear for them as well. So sharing to all engineers and developers. Did you hold any meetings to share the knowledge? Yes, after putting documents together, we had a meeting, and all of us at the meeting went through the pages of the document. But even if you share the document, at the time of implementation, I'm sure there will be inquiries to you on how to implement. How did you handle these questions and requests, inquiries? If there were questions, as quick as possible, I try to prepare myself so I could answer accurately. Okay, thank you. So I like to ask about behavior. codes. So load state flow is about the amount of traffic flow. And I've never used paging 3, so I'm not sure about the amount of the flow. But with this document, distinct until changed, you said that you use this code, right? Just with this, is it okay? Can it support various cases? Because maybe there are a lot of events with different types. Did you consider about throttling? I thought that was necessary. So after using paging 3, what do you think? Well, with PayPay Flea Market, my impression is that with this map, taking the initial state and also getting additional state only. And if there is no change, there will not be flow with this distinct until changed. So far, I believe that this is sufficient. Incidentally, if you have any specific numbers, how many or how much? Well, for the numbers, we don't track numbers or statistics, so I can get back to you. Okay, thank you. Next, refactoring and item table. From the empty, you've deleted. You went through this process, right? So, to start with this empty, I think it is a data that is determined whether there are still items left. So this normalized data was deleted, and I thought that was a very good step. But normalized data, it may have been added because of the performance requirement. So from the code, it may be difficult to identify and find out why such data existed. So how did you examine why those pieces were left in the code? Yes. In the database, a state were stored, and it was an initial code of PayPay Flea Market. But lately, in recent implementation, we don't manage there, but repository and view models were being used for the management. So it's clear that it's not related to implementation. So that is why we made a judgment that we can delete it. Did that answer your question? Yes. It's not performance related, so you already knew that it was not performance related.
So in my case, when I see these normalized data, JIT, blame and history, ETS, doc, management ticket, bug ticket, control tools. I looked into past tools like these. It was not so easy. So I thought that you may have gone through the same difficulty. That's why I asked this question. Are there anything? Okay, at the very last part of your presentation, you said that the state indication with the multiple APIs. I have a question about that. For the multiple states, you are merging them to indicate and show display. There was a slide on that. If you do that, merging states, well, for the layer to do that, I think there are different possibilities. You think you may have touched upon this, but on the depository layer, you can put them together. Or on the slide, it says within the presenter, you are putting them together, merging. It says in the slide. For the PayPay Flea Market, to begin with, for the integration of those data and the merging of those data, at which layer do you do? Is there any rules for that purpose? We don't have any particular rules, but for the merge of APIs, we use the view model punching and typing in order to merge. Does that mean basically it is left up to each implementer, or each module or each team, they can decide how to do that? Yes, that is the case. Okay, in PayPay Flea Market, this time you introduced the way you did with a code. So that's what you used for PayPay Flea Market. Yes, thank you. Lastly, let me ask you one more question. Yes, please. Lastly, going forward, for the change of libraries and improvements of development efficiencies, if there's any communication needed to other engineers, this is a broad-based initiative. So if you are to work on this as a new person, if you have any advice to these people who are trying to do the similar things, what can you say? Well, we have to think about the impact scope when you do something like this. By doing this kind of migration, what kind of impact can be inflicted on the service? We have to clarify the scope of impact. And then the findings have to be reflected on the document of the migration and share. It has to be shared with the team members so that you don't miss anything. That's what we learned. So investigation and documentation, those are two important steps for the smooth implementation. Thank you.